For 2 years, I drove 40 minutes every single day to sit with my dying mother. Every single day. Then at her funeral, my sister stood up in front of 60 people and said, "She never came. Not once." I was the only one who showed up for Mom. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just looked at the hospice director sitting 3 rows back because she knew the truth. And 2 days later, she called me. She said, "I think you need to see something." What she pulled up on that screen didn't just prove my sister was lying, it exposed exactly why she needed everyone to believe I wasn't there. Welcome back to Calm Verdict Stories, where we sit with the quiet, undramatic betrayals inside ordinary families, the ones that never make headlines, just the ones that quietly decide who gets remembered as the daughter who showed up and who gets remembered as the one who didn't. If you're new here, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you've ever had someone rewrite a story you lived through, you already know exactly why I'm telling you this one. I've sat with this particular story for a long time before deciding to actually share it, turning it over more times than I can count, wondering whether telling it publicly would feel like healing or like reopening something better left closed. I've decided, in the end, that stories like this one deserve to be told plainly, not for revenge, but because I suspect a lot of you watching have your own version of a sign-in sheet somewhere, your own quiet proof of showing up that nobody ever thought to ask about until it mattered. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 35 years old, and for 2 years, I was the one who actually showed up for my mother, Diane, while she was dying of ovarian cancer. I should tell you what showing up actually looked like because it matters enormously for everything that came after. Every day after work, I made the 40-minute drive out to the hospice facility on the edge of town, the same route so familiar by the end that I could have driven it with my eyes closed, past the same gas station, the same church, with the same reader board sign that changed its message every couple of weeks. The same left turn onto the gravel access road that led back to the facility. I signed in at the same front desk every single evening, said hello to the same rotating handful of nurses who came to know my face, my coffee order, the specific chair by my mother's bed that had become, without anyone ever formally assigning it, mine. My sister, Michelle, is 38, 3 years older than me, and had lived out of state for over a decade by the time our mother got sick. She flew in twice during those 2 years, once right after the initial diagnosis, once for a few days around a holiday, roughly a year later. I want to be careful here because I don't think Michelle is a monster, and I don't think this story is about a monster. I think it's about someone who found it easier to rewrite a story than to sit inside the guilt of the true one. Growing up, Michelle and I were close in the ordinary, uncomplicated way sisters 3 years apart often are, sharing a bedroom until I was around 10, borrowing each other's clothes through most of high school, drifting into the specific, comfortable distance that happens naturally once two people build separate adult lives in separate cities. She'd moved away for college and never really moved back, building a career and a life 1,400 miles from where we grew up, coming home for holidays every year or two, close enough in the way that photographs and phone calls create closeness without the daily texture of actually knowing what someone's real life looks like anymore. I don't think either of us fully anticipated, when our mother first got sick, how differently we'd each end up handling the years that followed, or how much distance, both literal and otherwise, would end up shaping which version of events eventually reached the rest of our family. Looking back now, I wonder sometimes whether the seeds of that funeral speech were planted long before our mother ever got sick. Some old, quiet insecurity Michelle had carried since childhood about being the older sister who moved away versus the younger one who stayed close, needing, perhaps, to to believe her own distance had been a kind of strength rather than what it actually was, an absence that would eventually need explaining to 60 people in a church pew. If you've ever watched someone you love slowly disappear in front of you day after day, you already know there's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes with it, one that has nothing to do with drama and everything to do with simple, relentless repetition. Stay with me through this one, because the version of my sister I understood at that funeral is not the version I understand now, and the gap between those two versions is exactly the part worth hearing. I want to say clearly before I go any further that I don't think this story is really about hospice records or sign-in sheets, or even, in the end, about Michelle specifically. I think it's about how easily a family can decide, collectively and without much scrutiny, which version of a difficult 2 years feels easiest to believe, and how much quiet work it can take to correct that decision once it's already settled into place. My mother's diagnosis came on an ordinary Tuesday, a phone call from her oncologist's office that started with the words, "We'd like you to come in together," the specific kind of sentence that tells you everything before anyone's actually said it. Stage 3 ovarian cancer, the doctor told us, sitting across from my mother and me in a small consultation room, treatment options available. But the prognosis, he said carefully, was not encouraging. I remember the exact texture of that room, the particular fluorescent hum, a box of tissues placed a little too deliberately on the small table between us, a poster on the wall about nutrition during chemotherapy that neither of us could quite bring ourselves to read closely. My mother sat very still through most of it, her hands folded in her lap, asking careful, practical questions about timelines and treatment options while I sat beside her, feeling like the floor had quietly given way beneath both of us. I remember driving my mother home that day in near silence, both of us staring straight ahead through the windshield, neither of us quite able to find the right words yet. She reached over at one point and took my hand, the way she used to when I was small and scared of something, and said simply, "Well, I suppose we'll figure out how to do this together." I called Michelle that same evening, sitting on the edge of my bed with the phone pressed to my ear, my voice cracking somewhere around the word cancer in a way I hadn't quite anticipated until I actually heard myself say it out loud. She cried on the phone, genuinely, I believe, told me she'd book a flight immediately, and she did, arriving 4 days later for what turned into a difficult, emotional week, the two of us taking turns sitting with our mother through her first round of consultations, figuring out the shape of what was coming. I remember that first week clearly, actually, both of us genuinely united in it, taking notes together during appointments, comparing our notes over coffee afterward, staying up late some nights researching treatment options and support groups, the particular closeness that sometimes happens between siblings in the immediate aftermath of frightening news, before the longer, harder stretch of actually living inside that news has fully begun. I remember feeling, that week, like we were actually going to do this together, the way our mother had said in the car. Michelle flew home after 10 days, citing work obligations she genuinely seemed to have, a demanding job in corporate communications that she talked about often and, I believe, honestly struggled to step away from. I understood that. I didn't resent it, not at first. Someone needed to be the one physically present, and given that I lived 20 minutes from our mother and Michelle lived nearly 1,400 miles away, it made a certain practical sense that the daily burden would fall to me. What I didn't fully expect was how completely it would fall to me for 2 entire years, while Michelle's involvement gradually thinned into occasional phone calls, then occasional texts. Then, by the final 6 months, almost nothing at all beyond a periodic message asking how mom's doing, sent, more often than not, late at night, at hours that suggested she was thinking of our mother only when her own day had quieted enough to allow the thought in. I remember noticing the pattern shift somewhere around month 4 or 5. The calls that had once been every few days stretching into once a week, then every couple of weeks, always accompanied by some reasonable-sounding explanation, a demanding project at work, a family commitment on her husband's side, the ordinary texture of a busy life that made each individual gap feel forgivable, even as the cumulative pattern became something else entirely. I never confronted her about it directly during those months, telling myself each time that everyone processes difficult things differently, that distance made certain kinds of involvement simply harder to sustain, that I shouldn't measure her love for our mother by the same yardstick I was measuring my own. Looking back now, I recognize that instinct, generous as it felt at the time, as part of what allowed the eventual funeral lie to land as convincingly as it did. I had spent 2 years quietly making excuses for her absence to myself, which meant I'd never built the kind of clear, documented case in my own mind that I'd need later, when her absence stopped being something I quietly forgave and became something she actively, publicly denied. I drove out to the hospice facility nearly every single evening for those final 8 months after my mother's condition had progressed to the point where round-the-clock care became necessary. I signed in every time at the same front desk, a simple clipboard log that every visitor filled out: name, date, time in, time out. A formality I never once thought twice about. The way you don't think twice about brushing your teeth or locking your front door. It was simply part of the routine, an unremarkable piece of paper that would end up mattering more than almost anything else in this entire story. I got to know the staff well over those months. A nurse named Denise Alvarez, the facility's hospice director in particular, came to recognize me the moment I walked through the door, greeting me some evenings with an update on how my mother's day had gone before I'd even made it to the front desk. She'd developed a habit somewhere around the 4th or 5th month of saving me a specific detail from the day, something small my mother had said or done, a joke she'd made about the hospital food, a moment of unexpected lucidity during an otherwise difficult afternoon, small gifts of information that made the 40-minute drive feel worthwhile even on the hardest days. There was another nurse, younger, named Priya, who used to bring me a cup of coffee unprompted on the evenings I arrived looking particularly worn down. A small kindness I've never forgotten. I remember one particularly difficult night, maybe 5 months in, when my mother had a rough afternoon and I arrived to find her sleeping, exhausted from pain that even the medication hadn't fully managed to control. Priya found me sitting in the hallway outside my mother's room, quietly falling apart in the specific way you do when you've been holding it together in front of everyone else all day, and simply sat down beside me without saying much, handing me a coffee and staying until I felt steady enough to go back in. She didn't try to fix anything that night, or offer the kind of hollow reassurance well-meaning people sometimes reach for in moments like that. She just stayed, quietly, the same way I'd been quietly staying for my mother every evening for months. And I remember thinking, sitting in that hallway, that showing up for someone doesn't always require words. Sometimes it's simply a body in a chair beside you, willing to wait as long as it takes. If you've ever spent months inside a place like that, you know exactly the specific, quiet community that forms among the people who show up there, night after night, for the hardest reason imaginable. The nurses at that facility became, in a strange way, some of the people who understood those 2 years of my life most completely, simply because they were the ones who actually witnessed them night after night, without needing me to explain or justify any of it. My mother died on a Tuesday evening in early spring, with me sitting beside her bed holding her hand, the same hand she'd held mine with in the car all those months earlier. Michelle arrived the following day, having flown in as soon as she got the call, understandably devastated, and I want to be honest that in that raw, immediate grief, I didn't think once about who had been present more or less over the preceding 2 years. My mother was gone. That was the only fact that mattered to me in that moment. The funeral took place about a week later, at the same church my mother had attended for decades. 60 or so people gathered in the pews, extended family, old friends, a scattering of former coworkers who'd stayed close to her over the years. Michelle asked to speak, which felt natural enough. She was the older daughter, and grief affects people in different ways, some needing to speak, others needing to simply sit quietly with it. I remember that morning clearly. The particular gray light coming through the church's stained glass windows. The specific smell of old wood and lilies that I suspect I'll never fully separate from grief for the rest of my life. I'd chosen the flowers myself, the readings, the particular hymn my mother had always said she wanted played at her funeral. Something we'd discussed together, plainly and without much sentimentality, during one of her more lucid afternoons only a few months before she died. I sat in the second row that morning feeling, despite everything, a strange kind of calm. The sense that I had done everything within my power to honor her properly. I want you to picture this moment the way I actually experienced it, because I think it matters. I was sitting in the second row, still raw, still barely holding myself together, expecting Michelle to say something about our mother's kindness, or her stubborn sense of humor, or the particular way she used to hum while she cooked. Instead, Michelle stood at the podium, dressed elegantly, composed in the specific way people are when they've rehearsed something even while insisting to themselves they haven't. And after a few opening remarks about our mother's strength, she said the words I will never forget for the rest of my life. She never came. Not once. I was the only one who showed up for Mom. I sat there in that pew in front of 60 people, most of whom had no way of knowing the actual truth of the last 2 years, and felt something in my chest go completely, unnaturally still. The church seemed, for a moment, to go entirely silent around me, even though I could hear, distantly, the ordinary sounds of a funeral continuing, someone shifting in a pew, a child fussing quietly a few rows back, the particular hush of 60 people absorbing a grieving daughter's words without any reason to question them. I didn't stand up, I didn't argue, I didn't cry, not in that moment, though I very much wanted to. I simply turned my head, slightly, and found Denise Alvarez sitting 3 rows back, having come to pay her own respects, her expression unreadable, but her eyes meeting mine in a way that told me she'd heard exactly what I'd heard, and knew exactly how untrue it was. Comment below if you've ever sat in a room full of people who believed a version of your own life that wasn't true, because that particular kind of stillness is unlike almost any other feeling I've experienced. I didn't correct Michelle that day. I want to explain why. Because I think it matters for understanding the 2 years that followed the funeral almost as much as the 2 years that preceded it. I was exhausted in a way I don't think I'd ever been exhausted before. Grief exhausted, body exhausted, the particular flatness that comes after watching someone die slowly over many months. Standing up in that church and arguing with my own sister over her mother's casket felt, in that moment, like it would have dishonored the day more than her lie already had. I told myself the truth didn't need defending. I told myself people who actually knew me would know better. I was wrong about how far that assumption would actually carry. In the weeks that followed, Michelle's version of events didn't stay contained to that one funeral speech. It spread quietly the way these things do, through phone calls and family gatherings I wasn't present for. An aunt mentioning to a cousin that it was such a shame Claire couldn't find the time those last 2 years, a family friend offering me condolences at the grocery store that carried an odd, sympathetic undertone I couldn't quite place until I understood, later, what version of events had been circulating. I remember that grocery store encounter specifically, an old family friend named Linda, who'd known my mother for decades, stopping me in the cereal aisle to offer her condolences. She squeezed my arm and said gently, "It must be such a comfort now, at least, that you get to make more time for family going forward." A strange, oblique comment that I turned over in my mind the entire drive home, not quite understanding its implication until weeks later when I finally pieced together what story had apparently reached her. My Aunt Pat, my mother's younger sister, mentioned to me directly at a small family gathering about a month after the funeral that she'd heard Michelle had been managing all of Mom's hospice communications those last 2 years, coordinating with the facility, staying on top of every detail, even while living so far away. I remember standing in my aunt's kitchen, holding a cup of coffee I'd stopped drinking, absorbing a claim so completely disconnected from reality that I genuinely didn't know, for a moment, how to respond to it. The kitchen smelled like the pot roast she always made for these gatherings, the same dish she'd been making for family functions since before I was born, and there was something almost surreal about hearing something so untrue said so plainly in such an ordinary, familiar setting. "That's not accurate, Aunt Pat," I said as evenly as I could manage. I was the one who spoke with the facility every single day. Aunt Pat's expression shifted into something politely skeptical, the particular look of someone who has already decided which version of a story they believe and isn't quite prepared to abandon it on the strength of one quiet correction. "Well," she said, "I'm sure there was plenty for both of you to handle." She patted my arm in a way that felt more dismissive than comforting, the gesture of someone closing a conversation rather than actually considering what had just been said, and turned back toward the stove to check on the pot roast. I let it go that day, still operating under the assumption that the truth would eventually settle itself out, the way water finds its own level given enough time. I remember driving home that evening, replaying the conversation, wondering whether I should have pushed harder, whether silence in that kitchen had been dignity or simply exhaustion wearing dignity's clothing. It didn't settle itself out. If anything, over the following weeks, the story seemed to calcify further, small details accumulating that made Michelle's version sound more, not less, credible to people who hadn't lived through the actual 2 years themselves. My cousin Rachel mentioned at a different gathering that Michelle had told her she'd been quietly handling all of Mom's end-of-life financial planning as well, on top of the hospice coordination, framing herself, in these retellings, as the tireless, behind-the-scenes daughter managing everything from a difficult distance, while I, apparently, had simply been absent. I remember Rachel telling me this over lunch, a few weeks after the Aunt Pat conversation, clearly uncomfortable relaying it, prefacing the whole thing with, "I don't know if this is even true, but Michelle mentioned something and I wanted to check with you directly instead of just assuming." I appreciated even then that Rachel had at least thought to verify rather than simply repeat it further, though the fact that the story had reached her at all told me how far it had already traveled. It occurred to me later how much smaller a rumor like that could have stayed if even one person along the chain had simply asked the same question Rachel eventually did, instead of passing the story forward exactly as they'd received it. I don't blame any single person in that chain particularly. I've simply come to understand, since all of this happened, how much of what a family believes about its own history rests on nobody bothering to check. I told Rachel plainly that I had personally handled every piece of paperwork related to my mother's care and eventual estate planning, sitting with an elder law attorney myself on 2 separate occasions to make sure everything was in order. Appointments Michelle had not attended, had not called into, and had, as far as I knew, no detailed knowledge of whatsoever. I remembered those 2 appointments clearly, sitting across from a patient, careful attorney named Mr. Ferris, walking through power of attorney documents and end-of-life care directives with my mother present for the first one, and alone, finalizing details, for the second, after her condition had progressed to the point where she could no longer easily participate in that kind of detailed conversation herself. Michelle had known those appointments were happening. I'd mentioned them in a passing text both times, but had never once asked a follow-up question about what was actually discussed or decided. Rachel looked genuinely troubled hearing that, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands, the way people do when they're recalibrating something they'd accepted as fact. I began to notice, around this same time, small comments from Denise Alvarez whenever I happened to run into her, comments that suggested Michelle had, in fact, contacted the facility during those 2 years, just not in the way anyone would have expected. Your sister called a few times, actually, Denise mentioned once, almost in passing, near the end of a conversation about something unrelated, mostly asking about paperwork. I remember filing that comment away without fully understanding its significance yet, some quiet instinct telling me it mattered without yet knowing exactly how. About 6 weeks after the funeral, Denise called me directly, her voice carrying a particular careful weight I hadn't heard from her before, even across 2 years of difficult conversations about my mother's declining health. "I think you need to see something," she told me. "Could you come by the facility this week?" I remember standing in my kitchen when that call came in, a dish towel still in one hand and feeling my whole body go still in a way that mirrored almost exactly the stillness I'd felt sitting in that church pew 6 weeks earlier. Something in Denise's tone told me this wasn't a casual request, and some part of me, some quiet, patient part that had been waiting since the funeral for this exact kind of confirmation, already suspected what it might be about. "Is everything all right?" I asked her, my voice not entirely steady. "I think it's better if we talk in person," she said, kindly but firmly. "I don't want to get into it over the phone. Can you come by Thursday evening?" You already know, if you've ever received a call like that, exactly the specific unease that settles in while you wait for whatever it is someone needs to show you in person rather than explain over the phone. I spent the 2 days before that Thursday in a strange, suspended state, going through my ordinary routine, work, dinner, sleep that didn't come easily, while some other part of my mind kept circling back to Denise's voice, trying to guess at what she might have found. I drove out to the facility 2 days later, the same 40-minute route I'd driven nearly every evening for 2 years. Strange now to be making that drive without my mother waiting at the end of it. The gas station looked the same. The church with the reader board had changed its message again. Something about faith and patience that felt almost pointed given where I was headed. Denise met me in her office, a small, plain room with a single window overlooking the parking lot, a few framed photos of her own family on the desk, a battered coffee mug that read, "World's Okayest Nurse," that I'd noticed on previous visits and, in some strange way, found comforting in its ordinariness. "Thank you for coming in," she said, gesturing for me to sit. I've thought about whether to do this for a couple of days now. I don't make a habit of getting involved in family matters after a patient passes, but something about that funeral has been sitting wrong with me since I left it. And once I started looking into it, I felt like you deserved to actually see this rather than just hear me describe it. She pulled up something on her computer screen before turning it to face me. It was the visitor sign-in log, the same clipboard system I'd filled out nearly every single evening for 2 years, now digitized and archived in the facility's record system. Denise scrolled through months of entries, my name appearing date after date after date, nearly every single day across the full 2-year span, occasionally missing a day here or there when work or illness had kept me away, but present, overwhelmingly, consistently present. I watched her scroll, month by month, my own name repeating down the screen in a kind of quiet, undeniable rhythm. March, then April, then May, entry after entry, some evenings with a brief note beside them, patient comfortable, family present, small clinical shorthand for what had actually been, on my end, some of the hardest and most important hours of my life. I want to be fair to Michelle about that one holiday visit, the second of her 2 recorded appearances in that log, because it wasn't nothing. She came for 4 days that December, sat with our mother, helped decorate a small tree in her hospice room, seemed, in those 4 days, genuinely present in a way that made me hopeful, foolishly perhaps, that her involvement might deepen again as our mother's condition worsened further. I remember thinking, watching them together that week, that maybe this was simply how Michelle needed to ration her presence, in concentrated bursts rather than steady daily visits, and that it wasn't necessarily less love, just a different shape of it. She flew home after those 4 days and didn't return again until the week our mother died, nearly 5 months later. I don't say this to diminish those 4 days. I say it because understanding the actual shape of her involvement, generous in short bursts, absent for the long, unglamorous middle, matters for understanding exactly how her funeral claim landed the way it did, erasing not just my 2 years of daily presence, but her own honest, if limited, 4 days as well, folding everything into a single, simpler story where she alone had shown up. Beside my own nearly unbroken record, Michelle's name appeared exactly twice in the entire 2-year log. Once during that difficult first week after the diagnosis, once during the holiday visit roughly a year later. "There's something else," Denise told me, her voice gentler now, pulling up a second document. "Your sister did call the facility several times over those 2 years. I pulled the call log too. She wasn't asking about your mother's comfort, or her pain levels, or anything related to her actual care. She was asking about the estate, about what documentation she'd need once your mother passed, about whether hospice records could help establish a timeline for financial purposes. I asked Denise, my voice not entirely steady, how many calls exactly. 5, she told me, checking the log again, spread out over about 8 months, always brief, always focused on paperwork and documentation rather than anything about my mother's actual well-being. Priya actually remembered one of those calls specifically, Denise added, when I mentioned pulling you in to see this. She was at the front desk when it came through. Said your sister asked pretty directly whether hospice stays counted towards certain tax provisions, and seemed almost impatient when Priya couldn't answer on the spot and had to transfer her to billing instead. Hearing that detail, small and specific as it was, landed harder than almost anything else in that office. It wasn't just those 2 columns of names anymore, mine repeated, hers nearly absent. It was a real remembered moment. A nurse at a front desk fielding a question about tax provisions from a daughter who hadn't once asked about her mother's pain levels in that same call. I sat in that small office for a long moment, Looking at those 2 columns of data, my own name repeated so many times it nearly blurred together, Michelle's name appearing exactly twice across 2 years, and understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that this had never really been about grief at all, not for Michelle. It had been about positioning herself, quietly and carefully, for whatever came after, while making sure that if anyone ever asked who had shown up, the answer that circulated would be the one that served her best. I confronted Michelle about a week later, over the phone, because I needed to hear her response before deciding what, if anything, to do with what Denise had shown me. I called her on a Sunday evening, sitting at my kitchen table with a printed copy of the sign-in log in front of me, my hands not entirely steady even though I'd rehearsed this conversation in my head a dozen times over the preceding week. "I have the sign-in log, Michelle," I told her, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. 2 years of it. My name almost every single day. Yours, twice. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before she answered, her voice defensive in a way I'd rarely heard from her before. "I couldn't handle seeing her like that, Claire," she said. "You don't understand what it's like watching someone deteriorate that way. I dealt with it differently than you did. That doesn't mean I wasn't grieving just as much." "I'm not asking about how you grieved," I told her. "I'm asking why you stood up at her funeral and told 60 people I never came. Not once, when you know, better than anyone, that isn't true." "I don't remember saying it exactly like that," she said, which struck me as a strange, small evasion, given how clearly I remembered every single word of it. Maybe I misspoke in the moment. Grief does strange things to people, Claire. I don't think you should be making this about being right instead of actually grieving Mom. "What about the phone calls?" I asked her. "Denise told me you called the facility 5 times over 2 years. Never once to ask how she was doing. Always about the estate, about documentation." There was a longer pause this time, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into something colder, more clipped. "I was being practical, Claire. Somebody needed to think about the paperwork side of things. You were so wrapped up in being there every single day that somebody had to think about what came next." That particular reframing, I noticed, was one she returned to several times over the following weeks, whenever I tried to raise the subject directly, gently redirecting every conversation away from what she'd actually said and done and back toward some implied accusation that I was the one prioritizing pride over grief. You already know if you've ever tried to hold someone accountable for something specific and watched them respond by making the conversation about your character instead. Exactly how disorienting that particular tactic can be. I hung up that first call feeling less like I'd gotten any real answers and more like I'd simply watched my sister perform the same reasonable, wounded tone she'd apparently been perfecting for 2 years, ready to deploy whenever anyone got close to the actual truth. I called my husband, Mark, into the kitchen right after that call ended, needing to say what had just happened out loud to someone before I could fully process it myself. He listened quietly while I recounted the whole conversation, Michelle's careful reframing, the accusation that I was making this about being right instead of grieving. "That's not what accountability sounds like," Mark said once I'd finished. "That's what someone sounds like when they've decided the story that protects them matters more than the story that's actually true. You don't owe her the benefit of the doubt anymore, Claire. Not after 2 years of this." I told him I wasn't sure yet what I wanted to do with any of it, whether confronting her further would help or just deepen whatever had already broken between us. He didn't push me toward any particular decision, just reminded me gently that I didn't have to figure it out that same night. I spent several weeks after that call uncertain what to actually do with what I knew. Part of me wanted to simply let it go, the same instinct that had kept me quiet at the funeral itself, the belief that dignified silence was somehow the more honorable path. But every family gathering after that, every quiet comment from an aunt or cousin who still believed the version Michelle had put into circulation, made that silence feel less like dignity and more like a slow, ongoing erasure of 2 years of my own life. Mark noticed the toll it was taking on me during those weeks, more than I probably let on. He found me one evening sitting at the kitchen table with the printed sign-in log spread out in front of me, staring at it without really reading it anymore, just needing to look at something true. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," he said, sitting down across from me. "But I don't think staying quiet is actually protecting anyone at this point, Claire. Not you, and honestly, probably not even her, letting her keep believing this works." I told him I knew that somewhere underneath the exhaustion, but that knowing it and being ready to act on it felt like two very different things some nights. My Aunt Pat, in particular, remained skeptical even after I mentioned the sign-in log to her directly a few weeks after my conversation with Michelle. "I'm sure there's context we're not aware of," she told me, a version of the same polite non-belief she'd offered the first time. And I remember feeling, in that moment, the particular exhaustion of trying to correct a story that had already found a comfortable place to settle in people's minds. I didn't push her further that day, recognizing something I've come to understand more clearly since, that some people need to see a thing themselves in undeniable physical form before a settled belief will actually move. Telling Aunt Pat about the log a second time hadn't worked any better than the first. It would take the log itself, laid out plainly where she couldn't avoid it, before that particular door finally opened. What finally changed things wasn't a dramatic confrontation, though I'd braced myself for one for weeks. It was something much quieter. About 2 months after the funeral, during a family group chat conversation about coordinating our mother's estate paperwork, Michelle made a comment almost offhand about how she'd need to review the hospice records herself since she'd been the one primarily coordinating with the facility. I remember reading that message standing in my kitchen, phone in hand, feeling something settle into place that had been building for 2 months. It wasn't rage exactly, more a kind of quiet, clear-eyed resolve, the specific feeling of finally being ready to stop waiting for the truth to settle itself out on its own. I didn't respond with anger. I simply took a photograph of the actual sign-in log, the printed pages Denise had given me copies of during our meeting, and posted it into the same family group chat. Without commentary, without accusation, just the plain factual record laid out for anyone to see. I typed a single caption beneath the photo, nothing more than sharing this for anyone who wants the actual visitor records from the last 2 years straight from the facility. The chat went quiet for what felt like a very long time. I sat at my kitchen table watching the little typing indicator appear and disappear several times without anyone actually sending a message. Everyone, I imagined, trying to figure out how to respond to 2 years of quiet columns suddenly appearing in the middle of an otherwise ordinary conversation about paperwork. My cousin Rachel was the first to respond, a simple message asking if that was really the full 2-year log. I confirmed that it was, and that Denise Alvarez could confirm its accuracy directly if anyone wanted to call the facility themselves. A few more messages trickled in after that, an uncle expressing quiet surprise, another cousin simply sending a single word, "Wow," that seemed to carry more weight than a longer message might have. Aunt Pat didn't respond in the group chat at all, but called me privately later that same evening, her voice quieter, more careful than it had been in any of our previous conversations. "I think I owe you an apology," she said. "I should have asked to see something like this a long time ago, instead of just believing whatever felt easiest to believe." I told her I appreciated that, and that I understood why Michelle's version had been the easier one to accept, easier in some ways, to imagine one daughter managing everything from a difficult distance than to imagine the actual, more complicated truth that the daughter who lived close by had simply, quietly, shown up every single day for 2 years while the other mostly hadn't. It's just easier to believe the version where nobody has to feel guilty about not asking more questions sooner, Aunt Pat admitted, quietly. I'm sorry I was one of those people. Michelle never responded in the group chat at all. She called me directly a few days later, her tone somewhere between defensive and wounded. You didn't need to do that in front of everyone, she said. You've made this into some kind of public trial. I posted a piece of paper, Michelle, I told her. I didn't say a single word about you. The paper said what it said. If you wanted to have a private conversation about this, she said, her voice rising slightly, you could have called me instead of humiliating me in front of the entire family. I did call you, I reminded her. Weeks ago, you told me I was making this about being right instead of grieving Mom. I gave you a private chance to just be honest about it. This wasn't the first option, Michelle. It was the last one after the first one didn't work. She didn't have a response to that. The conversation ended shortly after, without resolution, without anything resembling an apology, and that was, in many ways, the last real conversation we've had since, at least until the longer, quieter conversation we eventually had some months later. Family relationships shifted quietly after that, the way these things tend to, without any single dramatic reckoning. My Aunt Pat calls more often now and always asks, at some point in every conversation, how I'm actually doing, a small but noticeable change from the careful distance she'd kept in those first weeks after the funeral. My cousin Rachel sent me a message a few weeks later, simply saying she was sorry she hadn't asked more questions sooner. I've thought a lot since all of this happened about how easily an entire family absorbed a version of 2 years of my life that had almost nothing to do with what actually happened, simply because it was said confidently at the right moment by the person everyone least expected to lie. I don't think anyone in my family is a bad person for having believed Michelle initially. I've come to think of it less as a failure of any individual person's judgment and more as a simple human default that a confident, simple story will almost always spread faster and settle deeper than a quiet, complicated truth right up until the moment someone puts the actual paperwork on the table. I think most people, faced with a choice between a complicated truth and a simple, confidently delivered story, will choose the simple story almost every time, at least until something makes the complicated truth impossible to ignore. Michelle and I speak occasionally now, mostly logistics, mostly brief, the specific careful distance that settles between two people who've discovered they experience the same 2 years in entirely different, irreconcilable ways. We spoke once more at length a few months after the group chat incident at my request, mostly because I wanted to understand, if I could, whether there was any version of an actual apology underneath everything she'd said and done. I don't think I was trying to hurt you, she told me during that conversation, her voice quieter than it had been in any of our previous exchanges. I think I just couldn't stand the idea of everyone knowing I wasn't there, so I made myself the person who was, at least in the story I told. I know that's not okay. I don't really know how to fix it now. I asked her gently why she hadn't simply told the truth from the start, why the actual shape of her involvement, imperfect but not non-existent, hadn't felt like enough on its own. She was quiet for a long moment before answering. Because your version was always going to look better than mine, she finally said. And I didn't think I could stand everyone comparing us and me losing every single time. It felt easier to just take your version instead of living next to it. That admission, imperfect and incomplete as it was, told me more than anything else she'd said throughout the entire ordeal. A small window into the actual fear underneath the performance, the specific terror of being seen clearly by people whose opinion had always mattered to her more than she'd let on. I told her I appreciated her saying that much, even if it didn't undo the funeral, or the months of quiet rumor, or the 2 years she'd spent choosing distance over presence. I don't know if we'll ever fully repair what happened. I've made a kind of peace with that uncertainty, the same way I've made peace with understanding that some people will always find it easier to rewrite a story than to sit inside the guilt of the true one. I kept a copy of that sign-in log. Not out of bitterness, though I won't pretend there isn't some of that still sitting quietly underneath everything else. I keep it because it's the one piece of those 2 years that exists entirely outside of anyone's memory or retelling, plain columns of dates and names that don't care what anyone chooses to believe about them. It sits in a folder in my desk drawer now, along with a few photographs from those 2 years, a card my mother wrote me during one of her better weeks, a small collection of things that feel more true to what those years actually were than any story anyone else could tell about them afterward. The card is simple, just a few lines in her increasingly shaky handwriting, thanking me for the coffee and the company and the particular way I always found something to make her laugh even on the hardest days. I keep it folded inside the same folder as the sign-in log, an odd pairing perhaps, a mother's small note of gratitude beside a clinical record of dates and names. But together, they feel like the two halves of the same truth, the lived experience and the documented proof of it, sitting quietly side by side in a drawer, needing nothing further from anyone to make them real. I take it out sometimes, not often, usually on the anniversary of her death, and look at those pages again, my own name repeating down the columns, steady and unremarkable, and, in the end, exactly the kind of proof I never once thought I'd need. Showing up doesn't always feel like it counts in the moment, sitting in that same chair by my mother's bed night after night, signing my name on a clipboard that seemed, at the time, like the most unremarkable formality in the world. But it turns out that formality was quietly keeping the truth safe the entire time, waiting patiently for the one moment it would actually matter. I think about my mother often, especially on the drives I still occasionally take out past that old hospice facility, the same route so familiar I could still drive it with my eyes closed even now, years later. I stopped in to see Denise once, about a year after everything settled, mostly just to thank her properly for the courage it must have taken to make that first phone call, to get involved in something she easily could have stayed out of. She waved off my thanks, mostly, telling me that in her 30 years in hospice care, she'd seen enough families quietly reshape a person's final months into a story that served someone's guilt or grief better than the truth did, and that she'd simply decided, somewhere along the way, that patients like my mother deserved to have the truth of who actually showed up for them, protected, even after they were gone. Your mother talked about you constantly. Near the end, Denise told me that day, something she'd never mentioned before. Not in a sad way, just proud. She used to tell the day shift nurses, "Wait until you meet my daughter. She comes every single evening." I don't think she ever imagined she'd need someone to remember her saying that, but I did, and I'm glad I could hand it back to you when it actually mattered. I think about her hand in mine in the car that first day. Well, I suppose we'll figure out how to do this together, and I understand now, in a way I didn't fully understand then, that we did figure it out together, just not in the way either of us expected, and not with the sister either of us might have hoped would be there for all of it. If you've ever shown up quietly for someone day after day without expecting anyone to notice or remember it later, I hope this story told you something worth holding on to, because I promise you, the record exists somewhere, even when it doesn't feel like anyone's keeping one. I know not everyone has a hospice director willing to make that phone call or a sign-in sheet sitting quietly in a facility's archive, waiting to be pulled up on a screen. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this, it's simply that showing up matters even when nobody's watching closely enough to notice at the time, and that the people who actually witness your presence quietly, day after day, often end up mattering more than you realize until the moment you need them to. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had to prove a truth that should have simply been believed, tell me about it below. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to Calm Verdict Stories, because we've got a lot more of these quiet, true-to-life family reckonings coming, and I'd love to have you here for the next one.